Righty. Well, thank you for coming tonight. Once again, my name is Mike Dawson. I'll go ahead and introduce myself in a second in here. So this first part is going to be the introductory material of a little bit background, why FrogWatch exists, and a little bit about what's going on with our frogs and toads. But real quick, chapter coordinator, I am the chapter coordinator, and we also have another one, which is Carrie Lamry. She's not here tonight. But either of us, as well as Trincy, who is on here tonight working with us, can be contacted anytime if you have questions, and there's our email address. Mine's probably the easiest to remember. All you got to remember is the word Dawson. So Dawson@stlzoo.org. Pretty easy to get a hold of, or at least to find at the zoo. I work for the education department, but I work a lot with our herpetarium department, and I specialize in frog conservation. We also have a few additional staff as far as the bigger picture of our local FrogWatch chapter. And a lot of times we have had trainings in the past. COVID's made it a little harder, but we used to offer trainings, obviously in person, and next year we'll hopefully go back to some in-person trainings. But our contact out of Shaw Nature Preserve with the Botanical Gardens is Rachel Wellner, and she helps runs our projects and programs out there. So sometimes we'll do trainings there, and she might run those as well. But just to know, we do have other staff involved outside of the zoo staff. So I wanted to touch real quickly before we get into what we call traditional FrogWatch training, which is what tonight's about. But we do have other different ways to participate, different levels of participation. And this little chart at the bottom does a pretty good job of highlighting some of the different levels. And most of it's made on commitment time. But we have a program I call a FrogWatch Lite. And so if you don't have time, after tonight, and you're thinking I may not have as much time as I thought, to devote to something like this, you can still help out our chapter. And one of the ways you can help out, we have another kind of a side program, and the training happened 2 weeks ago, but the recordings of that training has been downloaded. We should have it up on our website by the end of this week. So you're welcome to watch that. And that one actually, just if you happen to be at a park and you see a frog, you hear a frog at any time, there really isn't any restrictions. If you can capture that by a photo or an auditory, there's a program you can just put it up on a platform, and we can go in and help identify it as well. But it's a great way for us to put some observations on a map and gets us a better idea. It doesn't capture all the stuff we're going to talk about tonight. And so the traditional FrogWatch chapter goes beyond just a presence and absence of different species, and we're going to talk about that. But even within our chapter, we are going to show you how you can register your own site and collect data at your own site, like if you have your own yard, or permission to go near a park or something like that. But we also have sites that you could also help us monitor. So these are chapter endorsed sites, and there's one in Forest Park. There's a few other ones, and we're every year trying to add a few different ones. And typically, because they can be monitored by multiple families and multiple people, the commitment, we're just asking maybe 2 times per month, because other people may also, take observations at the same locations versus if it's your own site that you register. So it might give you an idea that there's some different levels of commitment as far as participating and how much time. And all of this is voluntary. And if you start off a site and you get less than 2 times per week, that's okay. We're shooting for 2 times a week because it helps us give us enough data. But if it gets less than that, it's okay. Like I said, it's all voluntary. And every data that you collect helps us fill in the map and what's happening to our frogs and toads. So with that going on, this section I'm going to cover right now is basically a little bit of background and general information about what's going on. And then Trincy is going to talk about our FrogWatch protocols and how to collect the data. And then we'll wrap up tonight with some auditory training and learning a lot of our local frogs and their calls. So a little bit of background, like what's going on. There is amphibian decline. And as a matter of fact, it's worldwide decline. To give you an idea, if you look at the big picture, start at the world, amphibians, like a lot of other species, not as bad as you can see up here at corals, but a lot of species are a drastic decline over the years. Amphibians is one that actually this needs to be updated because it ends at 2010. Certain areas of the country, it's worse. To give you an idea, our world, I should say, is worse. Central and South America, these are areas with a highly number of species that are slowly disappearing with amphibians. Obviously, some of the tropical areas in Asia, tropical areas in Australia and Central and South America are hit the hardest. You can see some declines up on North America, which is mainly our southern states, and some out west. In the Midwest, we do have declines. It is not like you would find in the tropics, and there's some good reasons for that. But it's a steady decline, about a 2 to 3%. And so that we don't have a lot of species directly in the Midwest that are typically considered in danger. There is some in the Illinois area that have very specific habitats, but generally speaking, our populations are shrinking, but they're not devastating where we don't have massive die-offs and things like that, which is great, thank God. But why are amphibians being affected? And that's a good question to start with. Well, typically, whether you're looking in Central America, South America, or here, they're very sensitive to the environment, and one of it has to do with that permeable skin. So if you ever caught a frog or a toad, you probably know they have pretty smooth, typically thin skin. And it allows for oxygen and moisture to pass through, but it also allows chemicals and other things to enter their body. And so if you think of anything from runoff from a road or anything that gets in the water, fertilizers, pesticides, anything can also absorb through their skin. And so unfortunately, that is one of the other issues. And the other one is their life cycle. Their life cycle typically starts, at least in where we live, starts in the water, and most of them are in and out of water. And so they're in contact with a lot of these pollutants for most of their life. And so that's one of the reasons why, unfortunately, they are affected. But believe it or not, the biggest cause is still habitat loss. So even in our area, habitat loss or habitat alteration is probably the number one. But pollution is a pretty high one. Environmental changes, so exotic species and different predators, and that is an issue where we live. Harvesting exploitation is a problem in some places, not as a big deal with some of our frog species. But the other one that's pretty high and it's become prevalent worldwide, and this is why we have mass die-offs. There is a disease called, sometimes they refer to it as amphibian chytrid. And when they get too much of this fungal infection, they get what's called chytromyiasis, and it's basically a nasty fungal infection. The scientific name for it is Bacterochytrium dendrobatus, which doesn't really roll off your tongue. So sometimes I put the term BD. Sometimes you hear people talk about BD or amphibian BD or amphibian chytrid, because it's not an easy word to say. But this is what it looks like at a microscopic, if you zoom in. It is a fungus that can grow on their skin, and unfortunately, this particular fungus can grow on their skin while they're alive. And when it does, is it can actually cause microscopic holes as it grows over their skin, and they can get a bacteria infection, which is what eventually most likely kills a lot of frogs and toads, either suffocate from too much fungus or a bacteria infection. And just so you know, we have the chytrid fungus. It's all in our waters here. Majority of our amphibians have been living with it and are living with it, and can have some immunity to it to fight it off. There are other amphibians in our waters that have a harder time. Our hellbenders, which the zoo spends a lot of time raising hellbenders, also is fighting the chytrid fungus. And so it's not just stuck to frogs and toads, but any kind of amphibian in our area. But we even find it's microscopic, you can't see it, but we even find it in our ponds and fountains at the zoo. It's everywhere. In captivity, we can usually treat animals and stop it. In the wild, unfortunately, it's something that's really hard to stop, which is why it's spread worldwide. And some amphibian species are born with more immunity to it or not. And the immunity is in their secretions. Their slime and stuff has antifungal properties in it, and that's what protects them since they live on the ground. And some of them can fight this off, and there's some that just don't have the right antifungal properties. And so when this has been introduced worldwide, it's caused massive die-offs in some areas. We know for a fact it's been here in the United States for a long time, probably since the 1950s and 60s, which might be why a lot of our frogs don't have massive die-offs now. They might have had some die-offs. And there are some other new emerging diseases that we're starting to see. One's called a ranavirus that we don't think has taken big hold here yet. But these are some of the things that our frogs and toads are fighting. And the next question is a really good one, which is, well, why should we care? I mean, some people, I love frogs and toads, but some people may wonder, well, I don't like frogs and toads, but why should we care? Well, number one, they can, I don't always like this particular phrase, but they are like a canary in a coal mine in the fact that they're great bioindicators that something could be happening in our watersheds, the ones that we live in. This is a picture of actually me fishing. And so when you think of die-offs, you think of populations disappearing. It could indicate that there are other chemicals or other things happening, not just habitat destruction, things like that, but we've altered a lot of our wetland areas, and it has a huge effect on our frogs and toads. And it can also indicate other issues with our food chain. A lot of our frogs and toads, if you think of size from bullfrog down to a tiny little spring peeper, they are a huge part of the food chain, and they eat different sizes of insects. And so losing some of that diversity, unfortunately, you lose some of the diversity to the food chain. And we don't know the full effects of all those, but a lot of animals eat frogs and toads. And so as our frogs and toads disappear, that also could affect some of the other species that rely on them as food sources. And with that being said, frogs and toads are also important for many things. So of course, pest control is one of them. They're really great at eating frogs and toads, I'm sorry, eating all kinds of insects. And they also eat other frogs. Bigger frogs do eat smaller frogs. But in a lot of areas, medicine is also a really important thing for these guys. A lot of the secretions that protect them. A lot of people do ask, are frogs or toad poisonous? The answer is yes, but to different degrees. If you catch a frog and a toad, and it hurt your hand. If you lick your hand, sounds disgusting, I know. Will it hurt you? I don't know. Depending on what kind of frog or toad, you probably want to wash your hands. They do have chemicals that typically make them taste sour or nasty, and they can range in toxicity. Most of our frogs here, I'll be honest, I've forgotten to wash my hands and I'm fine. But you could, get some of the toxins in your mouth. That's why if a dog, and I had a dog when I was a kid, ate a toad, my dog got sick to the stomach and threw up. And usually most animals that it happens to won't eat another toad, but my dog had a basset hound, ate 3 toads. So it is something that there's a learning curve, but these chemicals can also be used for medicine in many ways. Now, our frogs and toads, like I said, aren't very poisonous, but there are frogs and toads like poison dart frogs in other areas of the world where their toxins are really strong and they can actually make muscles relax or quit moving. And so they've been able to use some of these in heart surgeries and things like that, or some type of medication to relieve pain. So there's really good uses for them. And there's other neat aspects of frogs and toads. In our area, we do have frogs that can also come close to freezing solid. And so cryogenics is also a neat area where you might be freezing something, a living tissue, and frogs and toads have adapted to be able to do that. And so they have really neat chemicals and physiology on the inside that can slow the nucleation of ice and be able to be frozen solid without damage and can thaw out and be just fine. So there's a lot of really neat research going on. And then finally, there's that cultural significance. Frogs and toads represent a lot of things to a lot of different people in different cultures. And so it's something that I would love to try to preserve, and a lot of other people are interested in trying to preserve our frogs and toads because they are an important place for many places in the food chain, all the way up to a cultural significance. So with that, what is FrogWatch and why did it come about? Well, what FrogWatch is, in a simple term that sounds really boring, is it's a long-term frog and toad citizen science monitoring program. And this is what was written down and published in 1998 when it was created. Sometimes we now refer it to a community science project, more inclusive than the citizen science project. But in a nutshell, what it is, and I like to think of it this way, is a dating monitoring service. It's a great way to be able to get an idea where you live, what's happening to your frogs and toads. And the main reason is it's taking a peek auditory wise of what's going on with the frogs and toads during their breeding season because they're noisy. And so it makes it an easier way actually than, looking for them in person, catching them and all that. FrogWatch, all you do is you're listening, and you'll be able to identify most frogs and toads by their calls. So it's a great way to figure out a couple things. And one is what species are where, because they do shift. And the other might be the phenology, the timing when they come out. Is it changing over time? And FrogWatch has grown from where it began in 1998 till today. There are, and I need to update this, there's more than 158 chapters across the United States. There's quite a few. And there's a lot more on the East Coast now, just beginning. And in the Midwest, you notice this map actually is not terribly inaccurate, but there's some more chapters, but there's not that many in the Midwest. And we don't know a lot about our Midwestern frogs. And so that's why our chapter is important. I'm actually in talks with a lot of people up in different places in Ohio and Michigan and stuff, and we're interested to work together to kind of find out in Iowa what's going on in this Midwestern area. And so it is a huge network of a lot of different chapters working together to try to create a bigger picture of the United States and what's happening. And FrogWatch has a huge participation, which I mentioned from 98, and I need to update this one as well. I haven't updated since the pandemic, but At this point, there were 3,800 registered sites with observations. So that's quite a bit during the season. And then at that point, we've had over 10,000 registered volunteers out there collecting data throughout the breeding season. And so it is neat to be a part of something that's so large. It will be changing hands this year at the top. FrogWatch itself is never going away, but it had been managed by the AZA, which is the American Zoological Association. And right now we don't know the exact people who are going to take it over. It could be National Geographic, we're not sure. But at some point, and if we'll put it on Facebook when we find out who the major partner is on top. But all of our stuff, as far as where data goes, will not change, and the protocols, things won't change. But there may be more sponsors at the top level by the end of this year. And what's going on in our area? Well, our chapter has been going on for a while, I think since 2011-ish. But last year we had over 15 active sites. I think total was 217 observations. 11 different species were identified in our area, which is fantastic. And so it goes up and down every year. But with the pandemic, that's really good to have this many active sites. And some of our sites will stay active for a couple of years, and sometimes they'll go away and they'll come back. Once they're registered, they're in somebody's name. They can always keep adding data to them. People can add data to somebody else's site if you get access to that site. If it's in your backyard, obviously nobody's adding data to your site. But if it's at a park or something, people can add data, but nobody can change the information about your site once you register it. And so some sites will eventually not collect data anymore. People quit doing this, but we'll get more sites, different sites registered. And it gives us a really good idea of a couple of different things. And one of the things give you an idea about observations. The observations are more important, I think, than how many registered sites. So the more registered sites does help. This gives us a really good picture of our frogs and toads in St. Louis, of what's happening when they come out. If they come out earlier or later over a longer period of time, you can get a better picture. Kind of like the idea of climate. Phenology tells us, is global climate change affecting these frogs and toads over a big picture? Every year do they, on an average, start calling earlier or calling later? So it gives us a better picture. What we've learned locally here, this gives you an idea, but typically on an average, there's about 10 different common species that are usually observed by our volunteers. And we are going to learn these frogs and toads tonight, or at least in a good introduction. And we have really good resources. So after tonight, if you don't remember everything, you can always, of course, go back and watch this, but there'll be many other resources that you can look at, learn more about frogs and toads if you're interested in wanting, get deeper into frogs and toads. We do have our own website, our chapter website, that has lots of good resources, and we'll mention it a couple of times tonight. So, but we're going to look at the Eastern American toad, spring peeper, gray tree frog, southern leopard frog, green frog, American bullfrog, the Blanchard's cricket frog, the boreal chorus frog, Fowler's toad, and pickerel frog. So these are the main ones we're going to focus on. There's going to be 2 or 3 more we'll mention that are in our area, but pretty rare. We are looking for these other ones, but these are the ones you most likely encounter somewhere. Some of these, you won't always hear all of them. We'll get into a little bit of the biology. All these guys don't all call and live in the same area. Some prefer open wooded areas. Some prefer a lake or a pond. Some prefer ephemeral ponds. So these could be ditches and areas of water that dry out. So typically you're never going to have a site that would have all of these, but you might have a collection of some of these frogs. The most common ones that we have reported in our area, and some of it is because they're loud and when people observe, but in the springtime, there's a lot of different frogs and toads calling. But the number one is our gray tree frog. It's loud. It's probably, some people consider it obnoxious, especially, and it lives around people a lot of times because it can climb trees, it can climb apartment buildings. Spring peepers are another one that's pretty common, at least reported. And that could be too that springtime is when most of our volunteers start listening. Some of these frogs and toads don't all call in the spring. There's some that call late spring and some that call in summertime. So you can get an idea, and we'll talk about when some of these guys call, but it gives you an idea of which ones more often you might run into. So when you look at our declines and what's happening here, I spent a lot of time looking at our data, and one of the things we noticed, and Tracy and I have been working on a project together called the Spring Peeper Project, is we have a lot of frogs and toads. This map represents all the different ones in our area. These are observations from FrogWatch, from our volunteers. These are observations from other community science-based projects. But we put them all on the map. It looks great. We have a lot of frogs and toads. But when you start to look at certain species, sometimes you see a different picture. And so one of the things we have noticed is some different species are not doing as well as others. And it could just be the habitat no longer exists. And so we're looking into some of these, but there's 3 of them that we are most concerned about, and that is the spring peeper, cricket frog, and chorus frog. And one of the things we noticed is, and you can kind of notice in this map, if you see this purple line, this is Interstate 270. And so one of the things we noticed is when you start getting past that, you go towards the city, inside the metro area, you really start to lose these species. And as a matter of fact, based on our recording observations, and we have recording devices we've been putting out last year and this year, the green dots that are inside that city no longer are there. So most likely, I hate to say it, but when we were done recording, there are a few places we found that didn't exist that we didn't know about. But for the most part, the map is going to be pretty empty on the inside. And any help that you could offer if you monitor a site and it happens to be inside that 270, it helps us if you hear one of these species, because we want to find out where these populations are. And if you want to learn more about our spring peeper project, you're welcome to. But the ultimate goal is to find out where they are and see what we can do to help bring them back. And so that's why knowing where our frogs and toads and learning the differences is very helpful. And the data, how it's being used is, of course, we are supporting the national goals of the FrogWatch program. And so there's some national goals looking at the diversity, the seasonality, and detect rare and invasive species, and sometimes they move. And also to identify maybe shifts in diversity. Certain species, for example, some species that are in our area are doing great, but you go to Michigan and they're endangered. And so we're starting to see changes, at the bigger picture level as well. And it also kind of shows the country's indicator of the wetland health. And so there are some good goals that we're helping at the big scale level. At the local level, one of the things is, of course, my spring peeper project, it is helping to answer some of these questions, which is one, where they are and where they are not. It's hard to get out to all these spots. And so having volunteers help us find where these frog species may be. But we're also looking, for suitable habitat. If we find that they're living in one area, then it's probably good habitat. So that's also very helpful as well. And so those are what the data does and how helping this project can help support some local conservation. So I'm going to stop now, and I've been rambling for a little bit. If anybody has any questions about this particular material, at least about the basics of FrogWatch, I'm going to go ahead and stop now, and you're welcome to ask any question you'd like. And I'll let it pause for a minute. And Tracy, let me know if anybody types something in.
All right, so somebody asked, what are some invasive species?
So in our area, as far as frogs, to my best of my knowledge, I do know that there have been some African clawed frogs that were released. They don't survive, but in the summertime, they have been identified as African clawed frogs in some of our watershed areas. But luckily enough, and they just don't survive the winter. So they don't multiply, but they can bring other diseases, into the water. Non-native frog species released in our water area, actually, the worst thing is most of them won't survive, but the issue is that if they have, obviously, chytrid fungus is one of them, and animals like that could be where chytrid fungus came from in the first place, from invasive species brought to a different place. But for the most part, we don't have any invasive species except for the fungus, which is not native. And that's a great question. Now, we are sometimes finding species that are outside their range, which is not necessarily invasive species. Trincy and I, and believe it or not, it was a volunteer from last year brought to my knowledge that they said they kept hearing a frog species that we didn't cover in presentation. And they recorded it and sent it to me. And indeed, I'm like, no, that is not one of the ones I covered. And it was a green tree frog. We cover the gray tree frog, which is typically not found in our area. It's found in southern Missouri, or at least farther south. And indeed, when we went into recording devices, and that particular volunteer was correct. And it was in the Jefferson Barracks area, that there was some sinkholes in there. We don't know how it got there, but there was several green tree frogs calling. And so that's also very helpful. And so it may just be, the shifting and moving. A great question.
Okay, we've got 3 more questions right now. One, we're actually going to answer in the next section. This person was asking, how do they see the established sites and sign up to monitor them? We're getting ready to go over that, but I'm glad you're thinking
Good question.
ahead. And another person asked, have any introductions within the St. Louis area been successful?
Good question. We have not gotten to the point of reintroducing our introductions yet. So I'm glad you asked that question. Ask it in a year from now or 2 years from now, but we have not gotten to that point yet. Right now, we are trying to, number one, identify where some of the species are right now. The next goal of like our Spring Peeper project is to identify suitable habitat that might exist within that 270 area. And one, by studying where we find those frogs, it'll help us answer to what factors of the habitat are the most important. We also are going to be studying some water quality factors as well, which will also answer a few things. For example, the pH of the water, nitrate levels, and a few other things. And so comparison wise, we might be able to find that there are great areas, for example, in Forest Park, that if they were to be introduced, they do just fine, or other parks. And so we are definitely looking at those aspects. And so identifying the same species that we can't find inside the metro area, finding where they are outside of 270 is also great, because those are close locations. And we're also hopefully working with our friends that do a lot of the green corridors that are starting to cut through the city. And we can work on trying to make those areas have some frog friendly habitats, because obviously frogs don't fly. And so they need a different mode of locomotion. They do move a lot, but they still need water occasionally as they move. And so there's lots of different things we can do. And that's a great question. Hopefully I'll have a better answer down the road. I can answer it.
All right, and we have another question. Can we report on frogs we see 100 miles south of us? We have a lake house in Southern Illinois.
The answer is yes. You definitely can. If there is no other chapter close, and I don't think there is. The only the closest other chapter outside of our area, I'm trying to think where it is. It's Springfield, Missouri. But in our area, I think we're the closest chapter. So yes, you can definitely can. You'd have to register the site itself. And there's two ways you could record that information. One, you could make it a site, and if you're down there, you can add some information to Field Scope, and we'll go over that. Or you could also do it a different way, which if you did a recording or a photo, and we can give you information about it, you can put it into, if you're not familiar with it, a program called iNaturalist. So there's more than one way that you could share that information, but the answer is yes. Fantastic.
All right, I think that's all the questions we have right now.
Okay, we are going to shift presentations here in a second, and Trincy's going to jump on in here, and I will try to answer questions in the background. I'm going to quit sharing here.
All right, can everyone hear me okay? Let me know in the chat if you're having trouble hearing me.
Yep, looks like they can hear you.
Awesome. All right, so Mike went over an introduction to FrogWatch, and now we're going to talk a little bit about how do you collect the data and get started with your site. So we're going to cover a quick intro of Field Scope. Then we'll go into a little more detail with Field Scope a little bit later on. We're going to talk about how you select your site, how you're going to collect your data, how you'll submit that data to Field Scope, and just some troubleshooting. Okay, so Field Scope is the website that we use with FrogWatch. It's a great place to just collect all of the data from all of our FrogWatch volunteers, and it makes it really easy for us to see all the observations that are being made by our volunteers. And it helps projects, like Mike mentioned, either across the whole entire US or just locally, like our Spring Peeper project. It's really easy to get started. You'll need to create an account first. And so you'll just need to give them your email, make a password. And after you set up an account and you're signed into your account, you'll go to the home page and it'll have a green add data button. So when you first make your first observation, you've signed up with your account, you're going to click on that add data button, and it's going to ask you where you've been making your observations or where you're going to make your observations. So you have a couple of options. You can use a site that has been previously established either through our chapter or another volunteer, or you can add a station. So adding a station, it's a site that you picked and where you've decided that you're going to go to every week. You'll only need to add your station one time. After that, you can search for your station and select that before you submit your data. What's really convenient is you can access this website from your smartphone. So while you're out at your site, you can enter all of your data while you're out at your site instead of having to write it all down and then go to your computer to submit your data. You can certainly do that if that's easier for you, but if you'd like to submit it on your smartphone, an easy thing that we found is you can save the website onto your home screen. So if you'd like to do that, you will go up to the top of your phone screen, click the three dots, and click Add to Home Screen. After that, you'll just name your shortcut, your bookmark, and then it'll save to your home screen. And that makes it easy. You can just click on that whenever you're out in the field. All right, so site selection. One thing to consider with the pandemic, we just have some COVID-19 safety tips. Make sure that you're checking local health guidelines. Don't gather in big groups, social distance when it's appropriate, and wash your hands after every visit. So like we said earlier, you have a couple of different options with sites. You can use a site that we already have with our chapter in Forest Park. And if you'd like to go to that site, just contact us and we can give you some more information about that site. That can be convenient for some people. It might be close. It might be convenient because you don't live within a wetland, so you need a good spot to observe frogs, and you know that you already have permission to access this site. You can,
Tracy, to let them
yeah.
know, we do also have a few other places in Forest Park, and we'll show you what it may be. We're always adding, but there's not a lot, but we do have some more than Forest Park. So.
Awesome, thank you for adding that. And then there's also the option to pick your own site. So you can do that in your own neighborhood if you live within a wetland, or you can go to a local park. Just make sure that you do have permission if you go to a local park. It's always best to get written permission just in case anybody stops to ask you if you're allowed to be there. And also be aware of curfew times. Some parks, their curfew is at sunset, and with FrogWatch, we start observing 30 minutes after sunset. So that's just something to be aware of. All right, so you want to make sure that you're choosing a site that's convenient for you to access weekly. You want to make sure that it's quiet, so you don't want a lot of background noise like construction noise or highway noise. Make sure that it's safe for you to be collecting that data in the evening. and make sure that it's legally accessible. You don't want to trespass on private property. Make sure you're getting that written permission. All right, so when you're registering your site, some of the information that you're going to need is the type of habitat, the origin of the wetland, the source or origin of water, the permanence of water, use of the land that's adjacent to the wetland, use of land within the wetland, and latitude and longitude. And like I said, that information you should only need once when you're initially registering your site. And if you need any more information about what qualifies as a wetland, you can visit our site, frogwatchstl.com/finding-frogs, and that'll give you more information about wetlands. And it is important that we collect data within a wetland because that's where the frogs and toads are going to be breeding. So that's where they're going to be calling. All right. So to collect our data, we're going to need a few things. It's highly recommended to have a copy of the monitoring protocols with you until you are absolutely sure you remember all the different steps. It's just nice to be able to review that. A stopwatch of some sort, it can be an actual stopwatch, your phone, or a wristwatch, just something that keeps time accurately. You'll need some sort of clipboard or firm writing surface, a pencil, written permission for private property or for even a park if you're going to be there after hours. First aid kit's always good, a flashlight, cell phone, and a notepad. And the notepad is good for writing down data if you're not going to be recording it directly into your cell phone. Optional rain gear, tape recorder, or cell phone, insect repellent, and thermometer. The thermometer you might want if you don't have access to a cell phone that will tell you what the temperature is, but you could also go online and look up what the temperature is at that time. Later when you get home or before you go out, you can look at the hourly forecast. And with the tape recorder, make sure that when you're listening to the frogs that tape recorder is just a backup in case you're not 100% sure what species, that the species that you said that you heard was what you actually heard. You can use that as a backup, but remember that sometimes those recorders don't always pick up all of the species that are calling. There might be a couple of quiet individuals. So it's best to write down all the species you're hearing at that time and then just use the recording as a backup. So before you get to the site, you want to practice identifying the calls, review the protocols, and check the weather. And if you need to, you can check weather history for the past 48 hours using weather.com. And make sure that you have the proper conditions for monitoring. The protocol is above 35 degrees Fahrenheit and not raining too hard nor too windy. You might be able to hear frogs when it's below 35 degrees or when it's raining hard or windy, but these are the protocols that FrogWatch has had since its conception. So for consistency's sake, we're just going to keep following these protocols. And same with monitoring at least 30 minutes after sunset. That's just for consistency. All right, so prior to arriving at the site, you'll need to collect some weather info. You'll need to know the wind speed, precipitation during your visit and in the past 48 hours, and the temperature during the past 48 hours, whether it's been mostly above freezing or below freezing. When you get to your site, you want to make sure that you either have a copy of the FrogWatch US data sheet, which can be found on our website if you want to print off a copy, or you can use a piece of paper to write down all that information, or like we said, you can record the data directly on your cell phone. And then also make sure before you arrive, you record weather information. So make sure that you're looking up the air temperature, the wind speed. So they have a scale called the Burford wind scale. And this is how people used to kind of gauge what the wind was like. But you can easily look up the wind speed now. So if it's 1 to 3 miles per hour, it's a 1. If it's 4 to 7 miles per hour, it's a 2. So you can just look that up online and compare it if you'd like, instead of making a fire to see if the smoke rises vertically. But you can, then we'll also need the current precipitation and, like we said, the past 48-hour weather history. All right, so whenever you're monitoring, you want to give at least 2 minutes for the frogs and toads to get acclimated to your presence. Some of the frog species you'll find are proud and don't care if you're there. Or there's going to be some species that are very quiet and they won't start calling until they think you've left. So giving that 2 minutes helps them warm up to you a little bit. And then make sure that you are listening for exactly 3 minutes after that 2-minute acclimation period. Please don't record any species before or after that 3 minutes. Even if you heard a species call right before, right after, it's best to just record what you heard in that 3-minute period of time. All right. Make sure that you're listening, identifying, and remembering all breeding calls and the call intensity. We'll kind of talk a little bit about the call intensity in a minute. And then if the monitoring session is interrupted by anything, there's some sort of loud noise that interrupts the monitoring session, you need to make sure that you restart, including that 2-minute acclimation period. And immediately following the 3-minute monitoring session, you're going to record your start and end time. And when you're done with your monitoring or done listening during that monitoring period, you're going to write down all of your species and their call intensity. So 0 is you didn't hear any frogs or toads. 1 is you could hear some individuals calling, but there was plenty of space between calls. 2 is you heard individuals calling, but they were overlapping a little bit. And 3 is it was a full chorus and it was hard to tell where one frog was starting to call, another was ending its call. So just constant overlap. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. This first one and this first audio is going to be a 1. So you could hear the individuals. It was really easy to hear the space between the calls. This next one will be a call intensity of 2. So there was some overlapping, but you could still tell where the individuals were starting calls. And then this last one is going to be a full chorus. All right, I hope I didn't blow anybody's speakers out with that. But it's really hard to tell where one frog starts and one ends its call. There's just constant overlap with the calls. So that's a full chorus. And then if you don't hear any calls, it's still important to report that. So you'll want to mark no calls heard. And like Mike was saying, that relates back to the spring peeper project. We're finding that there's some species that we're not hearing at all in certain areas. So it's good for us to know whether or not we're hearing any species in a particular area. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how you're going to submit this data. You'll need to put your observation date, your start end time, air temperature, wind, precipitation. Then there's a box that asks you what species you heard and the call intensity. And if you have multiple species, there's a button underneath that to add a frog and toad observation. And then if you have any notes, you can write that in. If you have any photos of frogs that you want to add, you can add those photos. If you have any documents, if you have any videos or audio, you can add those as well.
And those fields are new this year, so I haven't tried them myself. So if you have issues with them, let us know.
And then we've noticed that there are different options within FieldScope for some of the species that we have in our area. Some species are really similar to others. And we went off of what was recommended by the Missouri Department of Conservation based on research for this area. They've done some different genetic research to determine which species that we're hearing. For example, we used to think that we had the Western chorus frog here. It's very similar to the boreal chorus frog, and genetic testing has shown that we have the boreal chorus frog here. So it would be most accurate to add boreal chorus frog to FieldScope. But like we said, sometimes we do have rare cases of species that we didn't think would be here. So if you ever have any questions, feel free to send us a recording or just email us for clarification. But we do have this chart on our website as well if you ever need to refer back to it. But a couple of them that you might need some clarification on are like the cricket frog. Some people might call the cricket frog around here the eastern, the northern, or Blanchard's cricket frog. We most likely have the Blanchard's cricket frog. The gray tree frog that everybody hears, it's probably the best idea to put it as unknown gray tree frog species complex, because the gray tree frog and the Cope's gray tree frog are very hard to distinguish, and we are within both of their ranges. So it's best just to put unknown species complex. Then these are the breeding seasons for some of the frogs in our state or in our area. And these are some resources that you can definitely use. We have our website, frogwatchsdl.com. There's lots and lots of information on there about frog calls, wetlands, copies of the protocol, copy of the breeding season chart, which frogs are recommended to use, which frog names are recommended to use in Field Scope. Lots of good information there. And if you have any questions or need more resources, feel free to contact Mike. You can also contact me. I'm T. Beasley at stlzoo.org. And you can check out our FrogWatch Chapter website page on the zoo's website, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We're trying to be more active and connect with more people on social media. So definitely give us a follow. All right, now I think we're gonna take a 10-minute break. Mike, did you have anything before we start our break?
Yeah, before we start our break, we had 2 questions on here. So I'm gonna go ahead and answer them real quick. So what constitutes a site? And that's a great question. So typically a wetland site, but if you hear frogs and toads calling on a regular basis, it would be a site. Typically, if they're calling back and forth, they are probably breeding in that area very close by. So that would constitute a site, and that would include a ditch. It could include a homemade pond in the backyard. Anywhere that you could easily hear those animals can be considered a site. Now, there's people, for example, that will consider a site just inside a park, like their house is nearby, or they have, there's a legal place to park. You don't have to be near the pond itself, as long as you can easily hear the animals calling. You could register the site even though you couldn't walk there at nighttime or something like that. You just have to have legal a place to go with a car. Most people actually that I have talked to typically don't even leave their car. There's no really need to leave your car. A lot of places you could pull up in a parking lot and roll your window down. Obviously mosquitoes could be an issue, but you're only doing it for 3 minutes and listening. And so that's hopefully that answers your question. There's very few things that don't constitute a site. Obviously, there's no frogs there. There is not a site. What I usually recommend is if you think you know an area, check it out during the daytime for its safety wise, walk around, look. And if you don't see any frogs, then obviously go back maybe at nighttime and see. Some sites, for example, may have a species that's not going to call until summertime. But if you were there during the daytime and you go, oh, I saw frogs, but I don't hear anything, they may be a species that doesn't start calling until June. But the worst thing, and not the worst thing, but if you listen to a site for 3 to 4 months and never hear anything, there's a good chance there's no frogs there. So keep that in mind, and you're welcome to, let us know, send us the location, and we can try to answer questions by looking at the GPS of it, to give us opinion. And if you have any issues, kind of figure out the questions of setting the site up as far as, the questions they ask about permits of water. It's subjective in the lot. You just have pull down menus and you do your best you can to answer them. And we can show you the website in a minute before we go on break, just what it looks like. The website is very similar to your telephone, but I can show you if you register a site what those questions might be, and add data. The other question that we had here is, can you use a smartphone temperature? Use the smartphone temperature at the location? The answer is yes. Any device that is close enough to a temperature. Now you could obviously, a lot of apps look it up based on, I don't think it's GPS, usually it's based on zip code. That's fine. If you want to be more accurate, with a device in your car or a thermometer, that's fine. But for what we're doing, we need just the basic average temperature. So hopefully that answers. So real quick before you guys go on break, and we'll set a time just so everybody can get up and move around, because we're going to come back and we're going to spend a lot of time listening to frog calls. I thought it would be good. Tracy, could you quit sharing for a second? And I'm going to share my screen just real quick, and I'm going to show the website itself. I thought that might be just so people can see it, what it looks like, and navigation wise. Give me 1 second here, and I'm going to share this real quick. So it should take a minute to open up. So this is typically the website here. This is what your homepage will look like and everything. Obviously, there's a lot to it. The good thing to know, you're welcome to explore it. There's a lot of other things you can utilize this website for that you don't need to put data in. There's visualizations, like you could look at all the frogs in the whole country that are collected if you wanted to. You can make graphs and charts. These are things that I do. if I'm, studying the area. So if there's something you're interested in, you can. Obviously, there's a data thing, like you could look at right now. This is current. These are all the observations, I believe, right now. So this might just be looking at my observations. Oh yeah, so these are my observations right now. So this is anything that I've recorded recently, but you could look at the whole country. It may take a while to open up, but it is neat to look at, what everybody in the country is seeing. Usually the East Coast, you see observations first. It's a little slow. The program is run out of, I know National Geographic is one of the founders of this particular program. It takes a while. There we go. So right now you can see that there's observations on the West Coast being collected right now. We have a few in our area, obviously the East Coast, because they start calling earlier. So there are already volunteers out collecting data. So kind of get an idea that right now is a great time to get out. But to add data, this is what you spend most of your time doing when you register a site. You click the add data button and this is what pops up. The nice thing is, if you've already made a site, you click in here, and this is where these are previously used stations. These are my stations. So for example, I'll use this one. This is actually when I set up. You can see here, you probably can't even see, but there's actually a real pond there. But you click on that station's information loads in, and then all you have to do is you pick the date. Like right now, there's frogs calling down there. So you click on that. Visit information, there's just pull down menus. You'd put a time in here. You'd want to make sure the time is 3-minute window. The temperature, you can change it from Fahrenheit to Celsius if you wanted to, but you'd fill that in. Here's your wind thing. This is where I'm actually reaching out and I'm trying to ask them to put the wind speeds in here. So in the pull down menu, you wouldn't have to go look at another thing, but it's subjective in the fact that as long as you don't think it's a 4 or 5, you're one of these. But if you want to use the chart that we offer that tells you the wind speeds, you can be more accurate, but you'd fill that in. And these are the things you'd have to fill in. So you could do this, like I said, and like Trincy said, on the cell phone, but we'd put on if it's fog, mist, hail, snow, in 48 hours, it's just above freezing, below freezing. And then with your frog species, these are all, and it has every species in here. So be careful when you're picking your species, because sometimes I have seen where volunteers accidentally, they go to pick like American toad, but they click the one above it or one below it or something. And so you pick some toad from, I looked this one up one time. It's a frog from, I think, Texas. So just be careful when you pick it. And so I can see when people put stuff in. So if I, email you or reach out, and I may say, I've never heard of that frog species in Missouri. So, I may ask a question or something. So I'll typically looking out as observations come in, and especially the first couple people start putting in, it gives me an idea of what's happening in our area. But you can scroll down, you can find them all. You can also start typing in the first word or letter, and it'll pop it up. But that's what you're putting in here. So you would add one. And if you need to add another one, I'll just throw it in here. So let's just say American toad's calling. You can come down here and you'll be able to add additional frogs in here, and you'll add your intensity. So right now, individuals there, and then you just click this button and you add another frog and keep adding the ones that you hear. And you can always put notes, and this is where you would put like, I saw a frog, or something like that, or I'm not sure, you can write it in there. And that's it, and you save it. And that's every time you go, that's about how much time you need, 3 minutes to listen and fill this thing in, or write it down and go back and fill it in. So it's not terribly hard and doesn't take a lot of time, but it gives us a lot of good data of different observation sites and what's going on. So hopefully that answered a few questions. And if you needed to add a site, it's not that hard as well. So let's go ahead and add a site. So if I wanted to add a station, you can also drag, if you look at this black dot I'm moving around, you can zoom in using your mouse. I don't want to go to the ocean, sorry. Oh, sorry, there we go. So you could zoom in. If you knew the GPS location like you took on your phone, you could actually type it in here and it'll zoom in for you. But you zoom in as close as you can get to where you think your site is. You put a name in here, the city, the state, you fill all this information in, and you do your best to fill in this, whether it's suburban or urban or rural, all the stuff that Trincy went over, and you do your best to fill those in. And that's it, you create it. And so as far as setting up a site and registering the site, it doesn't take too much time. You just got to think about it a little bit. And you would have the option to alter it for some reason. You can change some of the information. So hopefully that answered a few questions for everybody. And I'm going to quit sharing my screen here. Is there any questions about the protocols I'll give it a second here. Otherwise, we're going to take it's like 7:34. So we're going to take a little bit of a 10-minute break here. And if you have other questions, feel free to ask them at the end here. When we come back here, so 10 minutes, let's say 7:43, we'll be back here and we are going to start our next session with frog calls and learn all the different frog species around here. All righty. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off my mic for a second. If anybody needs anything, just throw it in the chat or something like that. And we will be back at 7:43. All righty, we're going to get ready to get started again on the third portion of tonight. So this is going to cover the frogs and toads, the auditory training portion. So we'll introduce you all the different frog species, a little bit of, natural history of each species, and then of course focus will be on the calls of them and how to identify them. And then we'll end with some other examples of resources and places to go. And we'll talk a little bit about our website that gives some really good resources for our volunteers. One thing I did want to add, I know everybody might just be coming back now, but something about sites. If you end up registering your sites, I wanted to put this out there that you'd want to name them something that does not include anything if it's a personal nature. So like Bob's Backyard site is not something we want to see on Field Scope, just because we don't want to associate somebody can know that's your backyard or something like that. If that is something you choose, if it was something near your yard or something like that. But something that you could remember, obviously, but try to keep personal names and things out of it. It could just be, I don't know, if you live in a subdivision, maybe the subdivision's name wetland or something like that. So hopefully that answers the question, but we want to make sure that it's not an easy thing to identify, especially if somebody's personal yard or something like that. So I'm going to jump in here in a second. I'm going to make sure my box disappears in a minute, and we're going to get into the auditory training portion here. So give me 1 second. Before I do that, let's just make sure, Tracy, can you hear me well?
Yes, I can.
Okay, excellent. So I am going to be playing some calls. So just everybody out there, I obviously don't know exactly how loud it may be on your side. You may need to turn it down or you may not. You may need to turn it up. It just depends. But just be aware, I will be playing some calls and some of them could be loud. So I'm not 100% sure. Just to make sure that I have everything correct, I'm going to reshare this screen, make sure everything's optimized. Okay, we are good to go. Okay. All righty. Give me 1 second. Okay. My box should disappear in a second. So hopefully you'll have now a full screen. All righty, and I'm going to go ahead and move ahead. So when you talk about frogs or toads, anurans is the actual term for frogs and toads, the scientific grouping. What's neat about them is they make a lot of different noises. What we are going to be focusing on tonight is called their breeding call or advertisement call. And it's the dominant sound you hear during the breeding season. But do know that they make all kinds of other noises. And one good story, for example, that I've told in the past of other trainings, is the aggressive or agnostic call. And these are typically, sometimes they're referred to grunts and growls or things like that, but it's usually male to male combat or male to male confrontation. And it may be defending a site or something. Typically you hear more often after the breeding season. But one that happened to me is I had a volunteer who went to the training, was really good with their calls, and they kept hearing this sound that was like, and he recorded it for me. And I'll be honest, I don't know what it was, because frogs do make calls, and I have not heard this one before. And I thought, well, that's kind of neat. And so I recorded it, and then made a recording from. He actually filled up my phone messages like 6 times. And so I recorded it and sent it to the state herpetologist because I didn't know anybody else that could help me. And I figured real quickly I'll get a response back, and bam, I'll know what it is. And it took about a month and a half, and there was a whole long email chain of herpetologists, people arguing it. And what it turned out to be is a tree frog agnostic call. So there were 2 male tree frogs fighting over basically a branch or something like that. And it wasn't long afterwards since I heard it, I'm like, I've heard that before. And I heard it again and went out, and indeed I found 2 male tree frogs on a little branch, and obviously they're fighting over, hung over the water. So you may hear a few other noises, and if you do and you're not sure, record them, and I'll be more than happy to see if I can figure out what it is. But what we're covering tonight is the advertisement breeding call. Some of the other noises you might hear, the release call. This is if you ever pick up a toad and you hear him chirp, that's basically a toad or another frog species saying, put me down. And the reason why they've evolved this particular call, during the breeding season, males will jump on females to breed, but any other frog that gets in front of them, they'll jump on them well. And so it's basically saying, release me, I'm not a female. But you hear it a lot when you pick up males, more specifically. Rain call is really similar to the breeding call. It's just kind of a weak call. A lot of times you hear it maybe outside during the day, it's kind of rainy, overcast, or you hear it in the fall time. So you do hear, a version, but they're not breeding. It's just a similar call. And then there's the alarm call. This is that one where you walk to the pond, you hear and they all jump in the water. And most of those alarm calls are somewhat universal, where you can record it and you can play it, and all kinds of species jump in the water. Not saying to do that, but they're pretty similar to each other. So when you think of frogs and toads, of course, they have to be able to hear their own sounds. And this is a great picture I took of a bullfrog. And if you look at that tympanum, so this is the ear, if you want to think of almost like an eardrum, not exactly, but big flap of skin. There's a little a cavity behind that, but frequencies will vibrate the skin, obviously, and then bone parts behind it. But this is number one. They hear great. Frogs and toads have fantastic hearing. I also wanted to point out they have great eyeballs, so they have good eyesight, which is why if you ever try to get close, it's really hard. I try to film and photograph, and it's really hard to get close, man. They can see you during the daytime. Nighttime's actually the best time to get closer, take photos. It's harder those in the dark, so you need some headlamps. And sometimes this indicates, for example, if typically on most bullfrog, green frogs, and leopard frogs, some of the bigger frogs, if that tympanum is larger than that eyeball, typically it's probably a male. If it's about the same size, or smaller, it's probably a female. But there's something to look for. You'll see them on the likes of the bigger frogs. Some of the tiny frogs, it's pretty hard to see their tympanum, but that's one of the things to know about species recognition. Vocal sac wise, as we're talking about sound, I thought it'd be neat to talk about. There's typically 3 types of vocal sacs in frogs and toads. The one that is most common is on the right over here, that little vocal sac. We'll see it in toads, you'll see it in tree frogs. Basically a sac under the throat, and they can vibrate their vocal cords in there. And like tree frogs, they blow air over it and make noises. The other one that's also semi-common, at least some of the bigger ones, is a paired ear sac. So it's like having ear sacs on the side of your head, and you have 2 of them, one on either side. And this is why when you hear that sound, like the back and forth, a lot of times it's blowing air from one sac to the other sac, and then vocal cords in both places. So that's how they make those noises go back and forth. Sometimes when you hear like the rubbing balloon noise, they're animals that have that, usually that vocal sac on 2 sides. And then you have what's called an internal sac. And the only species I know in our area, I don't think there's any other one. I think it's just a bullfrog. And it looks like, I'll be honest, it looks like a frog ate a balloon. Their entire body, and I'll show you a little video clip of them in a minute, but their entire body vibrates and inflates their chest and everything. And typically those animals with internal vocal sacs have a really deep sound, and our bullfrogs definitely do indeed. So keep in mind that's just how these guys create their noises, and there's a little bit of difference. Typically, bullfrogs and noises, and bigger frogs do deeper sounds, smaller frogs do higher pitch sounds. So there are some neat factors influencing the intensity. Obviously, the time of year. That's why springtime for some species is good. The time of day, and that's one of the reasons why typically it peaks from sunset, tapers off around midnight. And so the traditional time period to listen for frogs typically is after sunset up until 1 or 2 p.m. And that's why. That's because that's when most frog species somewhere in there will call if it's their time to call. Some do not come out in the springtime, like I said earlier. Not all frogs and toads, their breeding season is just a little bit different, and they may come out, they may make a noise here and there, but they're not going to be breeding and loud until June or July. And so we'll talk about that. Precipitation, obviously frogs like water. And a lot of times they'll start calling. If it's a rainy day, they're calling right now. They're calling in the middle of the day because it's raining. If you think about it, they dry out. So rain's great. Overcast, rainy days, they're fantastic, and they can handle cold temperatures. So 40-degree weather is nothing for most frog species, especially in the springtime. So they'll be out calling without typically any issue. Another factor, obviously the temperature goes up or down. Colder, it does affect it, which is why there's that temperature thing below 35 degrees. It does start to change the pitch and the sound, and sometimes you can make a mistake of one species versus the other. And if there's two species calling, the sounds kind of mix together. And even on a recording that I could look at and graph, I sometimes have a hard time if the temperature's too low. And like trills aren't really fast, and so it makes odd sounding. And so that's why we typically want to be above 35 degrees. Size of the individual does make a difference. As a matter of fact, the size the sound and size are actually related in the fact that females are selecting the males that sound the best. And one of the things they're looking for typically is a healthy male. So if you had a little scrawny little toad, their call is not as deep, and that can influence whether or not the female chooses them to breed or not. So that the size of the animal itself does also affect their calling as well. And there's acoustic interference. Obviously, one of the things they are finding in some city areas, some frogs and toads may have a hard time hearing each other. Some of them have learned to call around different noises, and they may change their time period. But that is something that, as far as what we're doing, obviously car noises and stuff, it makes it pretty hard to sometimes pick up all the species that are there. So in St. Louis, there's in our area, and this includes Illinois side as well. So the Missouri, if you want to take St. Louis and just go around it in the Illinois side and around the city, there's about 23 species of toads and frogs in this area. We're not going to cover all 23 because that's a lot. I'll talk about generally about the 23, but we're going to focus in on those 10 that we mentioned earlier tonight. So they do break into about 5 categories. And so there are things called, and I'll explain why. One's called spadefoots. There's narrow-mouthed toads, and then there's what's called true toads, true frogs, and then tree frogs and their allies. And so we're going to look at both of these groups. And we do have all of these areas groups represented around the St. Louis area. Some of them are more rare than others, so we just don't hear them or see them more often. Spadefoot toads are pretty cool. They're pretty common in other places in the country. In our area, there's not many. In our area, traditionally, we used to have the plain spadefoot and the eastern spadefoot overlap. And they're the reason I call it spadefoot, they're not even toads technically. They just look like a toad. They have that kind of dry, warty skin. But if you look, the only picture I think is the one on the bottom. They have like a little hook, like a spade, like a shovel. And these guys are what's considered fossorial, which means they bury themselves typically in sand. So they used to be found along the riverbeds. And so the Mississippi and the Missouri and the Merrimack, which all kind of converge in St. Louis, typically the plain spadefoot would come along down the Missouri. And then we also had the eastern spadefoot, which would come up the Missouri and up the Mississippi, and they would kind of overlap where Alton, Illinois is in those areas. So at one point in time in history, we had both these species overlapping in St. Louis. Right now, I think we can probably find one of the spadefoot toads, still not sure which one. And in Chesterfield, we usually find some spadefoot toads out there. I think it's out there would be the plain spadefoot toad. But I've never had anybody record them in our area, or at least say that they heard them. And we'll go over their calls. They're pretty cool if you ever see them. They also may be up in the Riverlands or Alton area still. But a lot of times with the agriculture areas, they get, unfortunately, I hate to say the word ground in the ground, but they typically live in those the sandy soils up near the rivers. And so some of their habitat has disappeared. Narrow-mouthed toads, this is the only one, I'll be honest, I've never seen one in my life. I'd like to see one. They're really common in the tropics, and so it is cool to have one around here. I can tell you where type of habitat to find them. I don't think they're anywhere near the city area, although they're listed as possibly being closer to the metro area. But they're once again another fossorial. So most of their time in burrows. They eat crickets and they eat other insects on the ground. They come out at night. They do make weird noises, and we'll talk about them. They got a little funny fold of skin behind their small little point. They have pointy little heads, but usually you find them in wet glades. And so that would be like an open rocky area with hardly any trees, but there may be a little wetland nearby, and there's like grasses and there's little wet areas. So they're not common around our area, but just know that they do exist. You could find them in Missouri, just typically not around our area. And then there's true toads, and these are the ones we're all familiar with most likely. So the Eastern American toad up on the top right here. There's also what's called the Fowler's toad, similar in appearance. There are some differences, and we'll point them out. But typically what makes true toads different than everybody else, taxonomically, they're in their own group, but they have no teeth. And so if you open their mouth, there's nothing in there, no teeth, they're just bone. They do have bumpier, drier skin. And the other one in this picture is pretty good. They have parotid glands. And so this is this big bump here. And you can think of it this way, all frogs and toads, can secrete mucus and they have toxins, but most toads will have most of their toxins oozing out of that. So if you were to hold them long enough and they get irritated, or if you're a dog or a fox or, something like that, you bite them, what happens, there's little pinholes in that big bump and this white sappy stuff comes out. And it's toxic enough that it reacts really fast. If you get it on your lips, and I have unfortunately had, it burns your lips. And so, if you're an animal, you might spit them out. And it doesn't mean they're, animals can't eat them. Of course, birds eat them all the time. And raccoons figured out that you just eat from the bottom side. It sounds disgusting, but if you ever find a toad and he's eating out from underneath, probably a raccoon got him. But those are the two animals we have around here. Typically is the Eastern, and they overlap, and you'll find them. There's a little bit difference in habitat choice, and appearance is a little bit different, and the sounds are completely different. So we're going to listen to both sounds. And then there's true frogs. And so true frogs are the big guys. These are your bullfrogs, your southern leopard frog, green frog, pickerel frog. So most of these guys are very large. These are the ones that are also considered, what's the word? Sport? That's the wrong word, not sport frog, but you can eat these frogs. And there is a hunting season in Missouri. So these are typically the types of frog species that some people do eat when you eat frog legs and stuff, are one of the big true frog species. And these are typically almost all have web feet, and they spend most of their life in water, versus other ones that kind of come and go. These are pretty much like pond dwellers or lake animals. And then you have what I group them together. They're called tree frogs and their allies. So obviously tree frog, and you might have heard of tree frog, most of us have, but this includes relatives to them. And so what's interesting about all the ones listed here, and we'll learn some of these guys, is that chorus frogs, they all make very specific sounds. Most of them are early spring breeders, and so they either start real early, like in February, some are in April, but they come out pretty early. They metamorphosize really fast, and so these guys are going to lay their eggs in the pond, and by May they're out. They're already, little toadlets or froglets, I'm sorry, hopping around, so they move pretty fast. But if you think of their toes, there's a gradient. So tree frogs obviously can walk, and stick to stuff, whereas cricket frogs, they're not great toe pads, and so they go up on grass, and that's about it. They don't go up trees. Same with peepers and chorus frogs. They just don't climb very high. So they do have toe pads. They're just not as good as a tree frog or something like that. And these are the ones I'm most interested in. Some of these guys are very sensitive to changes in their environment. And I mentioned earlier the Illinois chorus frog, which we're not going to go over tonight, but if you happen to live in Illinois or you have a site that ends up in Illinois, let me know and we can make sure we get you calls of those species. But these are the 12 we're going to go over. And so I'm not going to read through them since we're going to go through them. But what I like to do is we're going to break them into some groups. I found sometimes it's easier sometimes to kind of group them, in a couple at a time and go that way. So we'll go ahead and do that. And so we're going to go through the the bullfrog, the American toad. And actually, I did move this, I forgot, to the end. We're going to listen to the Eastern mountain narrowmouth toad at the end. And then the other ones in this group, we're going to listen to the gray tree frog, the spring peeper, and the Blanchard's cricket frog. So we're going to listen actually to those particular ones first. So this is a good example of the American frog, or toad, I'm sorry, and they look different. They come in all kinds of colors, by the way, and sizes. In Forest Park, I've caught some that are bright red, like fire engine red, and I've seen some that are almost black in color, all same species. They typically, if you ever see their eggs, they lay like string eggs, which is kind of cool looking. But typically you find them everywhere. And if you look on the map down here, they're almost all over the place. They're not hard to find. This is probably the most common one besides something like a bullfrog in a pond that you may find. And you probably heard them, and you may not know you heard them if you never heard the sound. If you look down here, typically they do like a trill. They come out typically starting a little bit later. March is when they start coming out. April around our area is probably the middle of their breeding season. End up in May. They usually quit calling for breeding purposes in May. I'm going to play this little clip here, and this should give you a good idea. And there's other frogs calling in the background, but you'll know when the toad calls. And that's a good example. I'll go ahead and pause it there. And one of the things you can listen for is, you notice he stopped and then he's going to take a breath and he's going to call again. So that's something, if you're farther away, it sounds sometimes like a little cricket if you're really far away. The one thing I listen for in the beginning of the season is when stuff starts to come out, I'm like, is that a toad or is that an insect? If you listen, insects, because they're rubbing different parts of their legs and wing, they just get quieter and quieter. The toad, if you listen, he's doing that nice trill and then he stops because he's getting the air. And so if you listen for that nice break and you're like, a break, he starts again, it is a good indication that, yeah, you probably listened to a toad. But pretty unique sound. And we'll play some more in a minute, but remember this got that nice trill, typically about a 30-second trill. Now, here's the American bullfrog. And so a nice comparison. These are the most common that most people know about. One of the ways that you can always tell a bullfrog from the other big frogs, and this is a picture I have to give credit. My wife took this picture, so I got to give credit. We take photos together. And so this one, it's a good photo from above. And what you're looking for is a lot of the big frogs. And I'm going to move my mouse. I don't know if you can see it, but if you go with the eyeball, you go with the ear, and this is a girl, by the way, small tapanum. And if you were to go draw a line down, most frog species, like your leopard frogs and your green frogs, they have this fold of skin on this animal that goes around his ear. On other species, it goes from all the way down the side of his body. And so that's one of the ways, especially when they're tiny, you're like, is that a baby bullfrog or a green frog? Because they do come in some different shades and colors when they're younger. I look for that fold of skin. If that fold of skin just wraps around its ear, it's a bullfrog, no matter how small or big it is. They'll always have a wrap around their ear or tapanum. But they're our largest frog in North America, and it is true. They eat all kinds of stuff. They'll probably, for the most part, if you get them in a pond, you don't get that many other species, or at least another bullfrogs. They're pretty territorial. But they're typically, they like slow moving streams or lakes or ponds. And so you're not more of a river frog, species. You're going to find them usually in a lot of times on golf courses and every other place like that. They can handle, I hate to say it, a lot of pollution. So they're pretty common around the city. And then this guy, they do make, once again, you notice here, we have it in March. And I think they come out more in June, but typically they can come out in March. They'll start calling once in a while, but June is usually when you're like, oh, bullfrogs are out. But I'm gonna go ahead and play it. And this one takes a minute to get going here. If you watch his body, you can see that he's inflating almost half his body, and his whole body in the back goes up and down. And that's a good example. You watch this, is a good. And you notice that you're hearing a lot of calls from other species that call back, and that's pretty common. Once one calls, and it's a good example, is they're all fighting to attract a female. And so once one calls, the other one calls. And here's, I'm sorry, here's the Eastern, I do have it in here, the Eastern mouth toad. So I don't remember if I have, yep, I do have the call in here. I'm sorry, I was wrong. So this guy, which is not as common, but I know MDC says it is in our area. I just have not found a great place to hear it and listen. So maybe somebody might pick a place and you hear it. Typically, they like those prairies and other grassy areas. They have a very distinctive sound. So I'm going to go ahead and play their noise. It's pretty funny sounding. You'll hear it in a second. There it is. Sounds like sheep. There you go. So if you hear something that sounds bizarrely like sheep or something weird like that, let us know. And if you can find it in a site, that'd be wonderful. But this is not one I typically have anybody report that we have in our area, although MDC says it is in our area. So I'm looking myself, and so maybe one of our sites will find it. But it is typically start calling now, and you notice this guy's call is long. It can last a long time. And so which is nice. The ones that have very short times, and we'll talk about one. Unfortunately, there's one already done breeding. Like the season is done, and it came out in February, and it came out for like a week. But some of them have really short. Let's say about it. Now, this is one of my more favorite ones, which is the spring peeper, and obviously I'm running the spring peeper project. Their range is all over the place, except for, of course, we do know that the city they're absent in the city, but a lot of our parks at Ring 270, you can find these guys. And size-wise, it is good to know these are obviously from 3/4 to 1.5 inches. They're tiny. They're hard to see as well, but their sound is pretty loud, and they do like these ephemeral shallow ponds. And the reason why is they don't do well with predation. So if you're in an area with fish, they're not going to do well. They like areas that dry up because these guys have no problem and the leaf litter, like going out of the water once they're metamorphosized. As a matter of fact, they overwinter under leaves. They don't overwinter in the water. And so they're fine with ponds drying up. And they're early. So this is a February guy. And it is amazing. I've seen snow on the ground and hear these guys. I know they have different chemicals and peptides and stuff that in their bodies can lower the freezing point of ice, but I still find it amazing that they can call when it's that cold. That nice high pitch whistle. Sounds like little birds at nighttime. His little mouth going on. The nice thing about some of these species is they also usually call and breed in similar ponds than some of their other species do. So a lot of times you get to know the other species very well. You hear one, you're going to hear the other species. So a lot of them call together because they call at the same time and also similar habitats. Like typically you're never going to hear a peeper in a bullfrog because they usually do at different times, but you will hear possibly a cricket frog or a chorus frog. That's that particular frog. You notice that this, if you didn't see it, but the scientific name is Pseudacris crucifer. And one of the things, if you get close to a spring peeper, they actually have an X on their back, or at least it looks like a mottled X, which is where the name crucifer comes from. This is the next one we're going to do is the cricket frog. And once again, we mentioned we have what's considered the Blanchard's cricket frog. Ours typically has some form of green on it. It could be a green dot on its head, green on its back. But typically I have seen some brown ones, but all brown with very any green, but most of ours all have green somewhere on their bodies. What's neat about these guys is a lot of times you're going to find them more in river beds, gravel beds. They will breed in ponds and stuff like that, but during the rest of the year, you find them up and down the gravel bars. And I'm hoping to find some up in the middle of our city, but so far we have not had any luck. They sound very similar to me to marbles hitting together. And so in your head, one of the ways I remember it is it just sounds like take two marbles or rocks and like. So I think they're very unique, but this is usually a later one. So if you think of your spring peeper coming out, this is one that I'm like, April time. It's time for the spring. It's time for the cricket frogs. That's that particular sound. Nice marbles hitting together. Oops. And then we're going to wrap this little section up with the great tree frog. And the great tree frog, I've seen it spelled, just so you guys know. I don't know if I usually spell it with an E, but it can be spelled both ways. But what's neat about this one is they've adapted well to humans and they're found everywhere. It's important to know that they can be all green, by the way. There is some differences between a green tree frog and a great tree frog. One, green tree frogs don't sound like a great tree frog. But our tree frogs, if you look, they have a little bit of, it's called under their eye. It's like a brown or black little mark. And so it's sometimes easy to tell, even if they're all green on the back. A green tree frog actually has a white blaze down its side. So they actually look a little different than a great tree frog that has green on them. But they come in all different colors and shades. Obviously, they come in gray, but they come in gray and green, green, gray, all kinds of mixes. What I've noticed is when they're little, they seem more green in color to me and change over time. And their call is a nice echoing sound, but it is a nice hearty resonating trill. I would imagine most people have probably heard of this particular species. Pretty common around anywhere if you live anywhere in a city or a tree or a house. And this one, once again, is more of an April into June, July. They'll eventually wrap up somewhere in the middle. I usually think it's May and June is when they're done breeding. What's cool, if you ever see their tadpoles have bright red tails, which is kind of cool. They're the only species that have bright red on their tail. Oop, there we go. So let's do a little fun here. So we're going to do a poll in a second. I haven't done a poll in a while, but hopefully this works. Okay. Went all the way out. Hold on. So we're going to do a little poll in here, and we'll try to answer questions in a minute once I get to this section. I'm going to play a sound in here. So go ahead and listen, and you're going to try to guess, and I'll put a poll that you guys can actually answer. You might need to turn your sound up. It doesn't sound very loud. Sorry. Let me try this one again. Let's do this. I think it's louder. Let's see. That work. There we go. All right. So hopefully that you could hear that enough, but I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll. We'll give it a try here. Give me a second. I haven't done one of these in a while, so this looks like it. So I launched a poll, so hopefully you'll have an opportunity if you'd like to try to guess if it's an American toad, cricket frog, or spring peeper. So go ahead, and if you'd like to try to guess. We'll start off a little easier. All righty. We'll go ahead and I don't know how many people are out there tonight, but it looks like 7 out of 7 have answered. All righty. We'll go ahead and get ready to wrap this up, and we'll have a couple more we'll practice on here. All righty. Excellent. I'm going to go ahead and end this particular poll. So great job that, by the way. Most of us all answered cricket frog, and we'll go ahead, and that was indeed a cricket frog. So like 2 marbles hitting together. So a good one to start with here. So let's do a different one here. So I'm going to play this one, and I'll launch another poll. Oh, wrong one. All right, let me go ahead and launch another poll. Let's see. All right, I'm launching this one. If I need to, I can play it again, but I'm going to launch the poll. All righty, so we have some answers for great tree frog, some spring peeper. We'll go ahead and let it go for another minute or so here. We have answers of all 3. Good job, everybody. It looks like most people are favoring either the great tree frog or the spring peeper. And I'm going to go ahead and end that poll. And it is indeed, that is the great tree frog down here at the bottom. And I think my box might be covering up. I apologize. But that's the great tree frog calling down there. And so all of this is just practice. We'll make sure everybody has access to good resources. But let's do another one. Let's try one more. I'm going to put the poll up here, and then I'll play it. So give me a second. And here we go. Here's a poll. I'm going to play it. So let me know what you think it is here. And I can play it again here. Looks like most people have answered, but I'll play it while we're answering here. Okay, we'll wait another second here. And if anybody else wants to put an answer in, but I'm going to go ahead and end that poll. And majority of all of us said that it is an American toad, and that is correct. That is an American toad calling. And so if you look at that, that's a nice long trill with that little break because he had to take a breath. Similar to some of these other ones, it's one that disappears a lot in the background if there's a lot of other louder frogs. But let's make it a little harder here. I'm going to go ahead and launch yet another poll here. Oh, I keep hitting the wrong box, sorry. Let's see. I am going to launch this poll here. So I'll launch another one here. And the question is, how many different species do you hear calling? So not which ones, but how many different species. So your choices are 1, 2, or 3 species calling. And we can go ahead and play it again, but alrighty. And it looks like I'll let another few seconds go by here. I think most people have reached out and answered. So we're going to end that poll here. All right, good job. Almost everybody has said there's about 3 species, and that is correct. And I know it is 3 species. And we'll go to the next one. It is 3. I know because I made this recording itself. And I'm going to go to the next slide. So let's see if we can get which species it might be. So I don't know if this poll works right, so bear with me. I was trying something new. I think you can answer, click on more than one. So let's find out what happens, but I'm going to play it. So this is the same recording. Hopefully you can like click more than one. I don't know what happens, but we'll see what happens. But maybe not. Nobody's answering anything, so I'm not quite sure. Oh, okay. Lots of people answer. Okay. And I'm going to play it again. Okay. So it looks like what people chose here, it looks like we have quite a few people picking American toad, cricket frog, gray tree frog, spring peeper. Nobody has chose the bullfrog, and that is definitely correct. There's no bullfrog calling. So what is calling in this particular one, I'm going to end the poll, I think now. And I think everybody got that cricket frog, and the American toad is correct. What is not calling is the tree frog, but the spring peeper is definitely calling. So I'm going to go ahead and close this so you can see. But it was, again, these 3. And I sometimes you hear stuff and it is hard and it takes good practice. Typically what I do when I'm listening is you can cup your hand, but I listen for one frog species. I make sure that is what it is, and then I write it down, and then I focus on another one. And so when you're out there listening, that's how I focus on one species at a time, because you can easily get confused and or you hear different sounds sometimes. So we're going to move into group 2. And in this group, I'm going to hide once again my, give me a second. We're going to move into this next group. And this group consists of things that are a little bit harder to tell apart. The first group is a little easier with some practice. Some of these guys have bizarre sounds and harder sounds to remember. But we're going to cover in this group the Fowler's toad, the boreal chorus frog, which was formerly called the western chorus frog. Same frog, but we changed his name now. Pickerel frog, which is an unusual frog, but it's one of our bigger ones. And then we're also going to cover the green frog, the plains leopard frog, and the southern leopard frog. So we're going to cover all these. So Fowler's toad, if you look at this one, is a good picture. Sometimes they're in green, but they have a little white outline sometimes. And I mentioned that it overlaps. So if you were to look at this one and compare it to the American toad, they definitely overlap. This guy makes a different noise than the American toad. But what I have found it more often, they'll say sandy areas. I find it more in the gravelly bar sandy area than like in your yard or something like that, unless you happen to live on next to a marsh or something. But I'm gonna, and obviously in the green, you can see they're all over the place. But let's go ahead and get to their call. Their call is pretty different, and so instead of that long trill like a, these guys make a noise. Play one more time. And that's a pretty good, and you notice that time-wise, they come out almost exactly the same time as the American toad, which, you know, makes it harder visually if you saw them, but obviously if you listen to them at night, they don't sound the same. So, but that's the Fowler's toad. And then this is one of the ones I mentioned earlier we're looking for. This is one of our chorus frogs, the boreal chorus frog. They're about this size, a little bit bigger than a peeper, but a lot of times they have these stripes that go through their eye. And you typically find them in prairies and agricultural areas and things like that. But we're not having much luck finding these guys, unfortunately, in the metro area. And they were here in different places. But we are, like I said, we can find them in some places. I think these guys are more sensitive than all the other species we're looking for. But their sound is pretty distinctive. They definitely sound like, at least somebody says the word bree, or if you think of it this way, some people say it like you're running your finger down a comb. I don't know. Maybe you can come up with something better than I could. There's a lot of them in St. Charles, especially near the, the arena that's out there, the family arena. I hear them in the ditches and stuff out there. So sometimes people confuse them with that cricket frog, which is and these guys have more of a tone than these. I'm going to play another second of it so you guys can hear it. Now, if you look down below, you'll notice that they came out the same time as your peepers. And so obviously there's a big overlap. And matter of fact, half the time I find them with peepers. I'm calling at the same time, same ponds. So a good chance that if you have a pond with peepers, good chance you'll have a chorus frog or something like that. Now, this is the green frog. This is a picture that another one my wife took, or this is mine. It might be my picture, I'm not sure. But if you look, you can see that that long lateral line that comes down the side. So it's definitely different. And the tapanum's kind of smaller. So this is one I'm not 100% sure it was a male, but maybe female, not sure. Good size. They get close to the size of a bullfrog, a little bit smaller. And if you look down here, they're everywhere. You can find them in Forest Park, all over the place. They're pretty common. Where you find bullfrogs, you typically find a green frog, typically. I'm gonna go ahead and play their noise. Their noise is not my favorite. They range all over the place between like a twangy, like somebody going dun dun on a banjo, to kind of rubbing a balloon noise. It bounces all around. But if you notice down here, they typically don't start calling until May or June. There you go. You can hear them. Bum, bum, bum. There he goes. Bum, bum, bum. Take him a minute here to call. There he is. Boom. And that one's a male. You can see how big his eardrum was. I'll go ahead and pause it there, but that one's pretty distinctive if you were to hear it. And then here's our pickerel frog. Pickerel frogs, I occasionally will have somebody find one in their area they're surveying, but typically they're slow moving water, swampy areas. They have a very distinctive blotches that are more symmetrical, not all over the place, but in lines. Look like camouflage markings. But they sound somewhat to me like somebody's snoring a little bit. So a steady croak, but if you listen to it, it's pretty cool. And this is a paired vocal sac. Pretty cool species. So if you, it's one that does come out fairly early. So April is typically when they start. So there might be some people out there that might hear one of those. And then here's probably my favorite of all of them is the leopard frog. This is I can't tell if it's my photo or my wife's, but it's a good one. You can see a lot of them have green on them usually, but they come in obviously browns and stuff like that. Here's that nice long lateral line up and down their body, very pointy nose. Typically any freshwater place. Here's the cool thing that makes them different than like a green frog or a bullfrog. They call early. So they're like an early large frog calling. And so if you take a look, they're coming out in February. So when you hear peepers, you'll hear leopard, southern leopard frog. So which is neat. They've also, their niche is to come out a little bit earlier. Get this to play here. And they usually have what I consider like a laughing noise, a little chucking noise and a laugh. There's a good laugh in here. There it is. So if you hear something with a little bit of chuck, but then a little laugh, you're a southern leopard frog, and that's a good way to tell them apart. And then the plains leopard frog is something we're adding this year. I think we've actually had some of ours in our area. We just weren't quite sure. You notice the southern leopard frog had a little bit of, and then you go, these guys only have that chuck noise. So there's like, that's it. There is some visual things that might help you if you ever saw one. Once again, there's that nice lateral line, and there's typically, you can't see it in this picture, but there's a break in their lateral line. So back here, there's like a break in it, and it starts again. Visually, that's something you can always look for. And there's also a line under his eyeball. But sound-wise, it is very similar to the southern leopard frog. But if you look on some of the updated maps of Missouri Department of Conservation, they do say it is in our area. And I probably indeed have recorded and have heard them and didn't know it. But their call, once again, it's not February. And so it's a little bit later. So there's not a huge overlap in calling time. There's a little bit in the beginning. But I'll go ahead and play this one. Chuck, not that laughing noise. I'll play one more time. So those are our species. So kind of a very end of this section here. Let's go ahead, and I do have some polls here we'll play. Hopefully, if I just tap it once. Nope, it goes all the way out. Sorry, folks. All right, I'm gonna. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and I'll put a poll up here in a second, and we'll go ahead and see. I know this is just a short-term memory, but let's see what our memory remembers here from those species. So I'm gonna launch this one, and I'm gonna go ahead and play it. And your choices, of course, are Fowler's toad, chorus frog, or green frog. So you have a wah. You can't quite hear it. So go ahead if you want to let us know what you think it is, and I'll play it again. It's a wah. All right, looks like almost everybody that's voting so far, pretty consistent here between a chorus frog and a Fowler's toad. Good, that's all of us. I'm going to end that poll. Excellent. This happens to be a Fowler's toad, so that's that wah noise. It's pretty distinctive once you learn it. So let's go ahead and we'll close this poll and we'll go to the next one. Yep, and it is, once again, that's what this graph looks like. That's a little Fowler's toad. So we'll do this one again. I'm going to launch another poll, and here we go. So here's the next one. I'm going to go ahead and play it. Got that nice little chuck and then a laugh. Oh, and I see a mistake here, actually. It's none of those species, but leopard frog, very good. And it's the southern leopard frog. I think most people have already voted, actually. But if you haven't voted, I think I just gave it away. Sorry. But that is the southern leopard frog playing, and you can hear the laughing noise. It's not a Fowler's toad. We just heard that one, and it's not a pickerel frog. So that is that southern leopard frog in that particular poll. And we'll go to the next slide here. Once again, it's that leopard frog. Let's try this particular one here. And I'm going to go to this one here. I'm going to launch this one. So this is, I'm going to play it here and see if you can guess what this noise is. Kind of sounds like a rain stick or something like that. Well, everybody put a vote out there, and I'll play it again if it's helpful. But it's not a laughing noise. It's not a wah. Obviously, by choice of elimination, you get pretty close. But real good. You guys 100% on chorus frog. And that is indeed that particular chorus frog that's down here on the little bottom, little tiny little guy. So that's kind of an introduction to the majority of our frogs here. I am gonna play a couple sounds just at the very end here that are either some other species just to be aware of. And so here's that narrow-mouthed toad I mentioned. It's a fossorial guy, and as you can see that you can find him sometimes down here. Play him again. There's that noise again. Sounds like sheep or something like that. And play one more time. and it sounds like sheep. So if you hear that, that is something that we are looking for. Once again, here's that spade foot toad, a little bit different, because like this one has a funny noise. Ah. So I wanted to introduce some new sounds in case you hear something out there. I'm going to introduce one more. This is one that I don't think you'll come across, but if you do, it'd be great. This is the one I mentioned that this breeding season is like short. He's already done. He is one of the large frogs, but he's a tiny large frog. So imagine a bullfrog and you shrink him down to the size of almost the size of a chorus frog or something like that. They do have long legs and everything and live in water. They just come out early in the spring and they do breed really early. So February, these guys are out calling. They sound like ducks, at least to me. Sometimes they call raspy quacks. I've heard about Columbia Bottoms and a few other places. So they are not far from our city, so there may be other locations where they exist. But that's what they sound like. And they sound odd. The first time I heard them, I actually thought a bunch of ducks had flown in or something, because I was far away and I was like, what is that weird noise? But they're pretty cool. And these are one of the few species that are completely freeze tolerant, which means this is the best part if you like natural history. Wood frogs range from here all the way to Canada. And this particular species can be frozen 100% solid, like dead. And they come back to life. So like their heart stops and their brain turns off. And they thaw out and everything comes back online, which is insane, but it is neat. If you ever find one, you want to just put it back on the ground. But if you warm it up, I guess it's like a parlor trick. You're like, I can make them come back to life. You warm them up and they come back to life. But they can freeze solid. So they're a really unique species to me that we find here in Missouri. So those are our species. Once again, to wrap up, we had mentioned that, and we'll have this, and I'll show you exactly where you can find some of this. But we would prefer if you would use these recommended lists, and these are based on our MDC species that MDC recommends we have in our state, and are also found in the pull down menus and field scope. If you were to put one of these other ones, it's not going to be the end of the world. You know, we can know that if you clicked unknown leopard frog, well, we'll assume it's plains or southern leopard frog or something like that, because we know what species we have here. But for consistency, it makes it easier as we're pulling data out if we all use the same pull downs, or at least the same choices. If you wanted to, after you get really good at your frog calls, we do have something called volunteer certification, and you can become a certified volunteer. Doesn't mean you have to do this to participate, but what we'll do is there's an auditory test you can take. And so what we'll do is in the backside of your field scope, we can actually flag that yours are certified. So if we're pulling data sets out, we can pull out just the observation from people we know can score, I think it's like an 80% or higher on an auditory test. And it's an online test. We run it out of our website. And if something you want to do, I would recommend if you're just starting off to make sure you're really good before you take it. You can take it as many times as you want, but to learn your frog calls. And we also ask a few questions about protocols. You know, we'll ask you, do you listen for 20 minutes? Once the answer will be no, we listen for 3 minutes. So we'll ask some basic protocol questions to make sure we know that you're following the protocols and you know your frog calls. And so that's something, if you were interested in doing, you get a little certificate we'll mail to you that you are a certified volunteer. Typically, I usually put stuff out in about May. You know, I'll remind people and volunteers if they'd like to become certified, they're more than welcome to. Although I think it's, Trincy can tell me if I'm wrong, but I think it's actually active now if you were to go online. But what we recommend, you know, is to practice your calls first before you go get certified, and then check our website. And I'm actually going to show you our website before we wrap up here. So one of the best resources, and you can use it even if you're not a volunteer, but I'm going to go ahead and show you here. It looks like this, and I'm going to actually quit sharing and then jump to our website, and then we'll wrap up with questions there real quick. So I'm going to now jump to here. Oh, wrong place, sorry. Stop sharing, I didn't do it right. There we go. There we go, okay. Here we go, okay. Just as this is our St. Louis website. It's easy to find. All you got to remember is frogwatchstl.com. So it's pretty easy to find. It is our chapter website. Is not directed or directly related to the zoo, although ours we do have links from here that take you back to the zoo. That's where you registered for this. We do our registration on our zoo's FrogWatch page, but all of our other resources and frog calls are on here. What I wanted to show you is there's a tab that says FrogWatch Volunteers. So if you're a volunteer and you wanted to go watch the presentation, we will go ahead, and these are ones from last year, but as soon as we're done with these presentations, we will finish recording them and put them here. So you'll be able to watch tonight's presentation right here, so you can go backwards and watch it. But all of our other presentations are all on here as well. So you could go back through and just the slides of the protocols, and there's actually more information that I did not cover in these slides that you could go through. There's links to, you want to learn about more wetlands and all kinds of things are in here. If there's something you cannot find, please reach out to me and we can make sure it's available on our website for our volunteers. But in the pull down menus, there's all different types of places. We had mentioned chapter surveying sites. If you go here, it'll actually have a map. So you can see, well, there's one in Jefferson County, West County. So you can look around and if you have a place that you might recommend, let us know. We're trying to expand just so we have more places. What makes these places, number one, some of our recommended places, is they have access that you don't have to get out of your car. We know what their curfew times are and things like that. So we do have some information where to park and they're safe to go to. So that's why we consider these our chapter locations. And these are areas that we're interested in around the city, but we're interested in any other areas that you might want to go. But know that there's information on here that you could follow. When we get a brand new, there's some information on Field Scope. We are working on a new Field Scope, what do you want to call it, a tutorial. And so when we get that up, we'll have that under here. But frog calls, say you want to practice your frog calls, you can come to this website and there's calls embedded in here, and we're always adding more stuff. So you can listen to them over and over again, read about them again, and get good at listening to your frog calls. So we try to update this and keep everything updated. But feel free to check it out. There's other things in here, information about finding frogs. And if you want to know more about, of course, our Spring Peeper program, there's information about it on here. You can read about what some of your data might be helping. So that's a great place to go. I'm going to now quit sharing. I know we have a few questions and we're about out of time. So I'm going to stop now and we're going to try to answer as many questions as we can. So let's see, I'm going to actually turn my camera on so you can see me. There we go. So let's see. Let's go ahead and look at the questions, Trincy. Let's see. Did Mike answer your question during the frog call portion? What question was it? Let's see, anybody know?
It was a little further up in the chat.
Oh, there's lots of stuff in here. Let's see. What did I miss a bunch? Let's see.
No, you answered a lot of them earlier.
Okay. Make sure I haven't missed a major anything. Okay. Okay, we answered that one. Okay. Is there any other questions that anybody has? You're welcome to put them in the chat or question and answer, and we'll try to answer them all. Let's see. There's one up here. How many days between surveys? So the answer to that, typically if you're registering the site or something like that twice a week, typically what I would recommend is you spread them out with maybe a day, at least a day in between if you can. If you cannot, it's okay if they're back to back. But the more spaced out in a week, if you did two, obviously you could do all 5 days if you had the time. But typically we're recommending and asking about 2 times a week. And it's more of a sampling thing. So if you spread them out more, just because if you think of the weather, if the weather is dry and hot, sometimes nobody's calling, so if you spread them out more statistically, over a month's time, you'll hear more calling than if, they're really close together, because in a week's time, the weather might change from a Monday to a Friday. So hopefully that answers your question. There is no set parameter or protocols for how many days between surveys. Great question. Is there any other questions, Trincy, that I have not answered that you are aware of?
There's one in the chat asking, when do they start?
As far as frogs or when they might begin monitoring a site, the frogs are calling now. Actually, they started about 2 weeks ago, at least some species. You are welcome to begin now. So if you wanted to tomorrow go find a site or use one of our sites, you're welcome to. Either or works fine, but you could go ahead as of tomorrow and start monitoring the site if you had the time to, set up an account and everything. Great question. All righty. Well, I don't see any other questions. If we didn't answer something and you weren't able to ask it tonight, you are welcome to email us, and then we'll do what we can to answer our questions. If you can, in the subject, just put the word FrogWatch, something like that in there, so I can filter anything out and make sure I get back to you. But we will have some stuff posted. The only other thing I would want to bring up is check our Facebook feed. We do try to post, if we can, on a regular basis, and if there's any changes or updates, it's a great way, to see anything new. And as well as reaching out, we're trying to create the best that we can with a local community. So, if you hear something frog, share your frog calls, or if you feel comfortable doing that, or what you're hearing. And I'm on it every night, so if I see it, I'll respond myself. But it's great to see our volunteers reaching out, to each other and what they're finding. So feel free to utilize that if you see something, hear something, or if you're not sure of our protocol too. We can always answer through Facebook as well. So that is it for tonight. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. But I did want to say thanks everybody for their time to come tonight and listen. Hope you found it worthwhile, and we will be sending out possibly in a day or so, maybe a little survey just to let us know what you guys thought and things we can improve on. So thank you everybody for coming tonight.